When I stepped into the briefing room, my father-in-law, the Navy SEAL Admiral, grinned and asked, "What's your call sign, sweetheart?" The room erupted in laughter. I smiled back, steady and calm. "It's Valkyrie," I said. The laughter stopped. Respect didn't need to be requested, it was earned. "You're coming to my briefing tomorrow as a civilian observer," Simon announced at Sunday dinner, sliding the formal invitation across the table while Luke carved the roast. "Time you learned how real military operations work." My daughters were upstairs doing homework, missing the moment their grandfather finally overplayed his hand. 3 years I'd waited for him to make this exact mistake, thinking he could humiliate me publicly without knowing who I really was. Before we continue, if you've ever felt dismissed or underestimated despite your accomplishments, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps these important stories reach others who need them. Now let's see what happens next. The invitation sat between the mashed potatoes and green beans, its Naval Station Norfolk letterhead reflecting the dining room chandelier. Luke's knife paused mid-slice through the meat. He recognized the trap his father was setting but didn't know I'd been preparing for exactly this moment since the day Simon first dismissed me as an inadequate addition to the Hawthorne military legacy. "That's thoughtful of you, Dad," Luke said carefully, his tone measured in that way he'd perfected after years of navigating his father's moods. His hand found mine under the table, a silent apology for whatever humiliation he assumed was coming. He had no idea that the invitation represented my opportunity, not Simon's. Simon leaned back in his chair, satisfaction radiating from every line of his weathered face. At 62 he still carried himself with the authority of active duty, even in civilian clothes. His gray beard was trimmed with military precision, and his eyes held that particular coldness reserved for those he considered beneath his notice. For 3 years that had been me. "Well, someone needs to understand what real service looks like," he said, cutting into his meat with deliberate force. "All this civilian flying, these medical transport runs, it's important work, I suppose. But it's not the same as military operations. Different league entirely." The dismissiveness in his voice was practiced, perfected over countless dinners where he'd systematically diminished everything about my career. To him, I flew sick people between hospitals, a glorified ambulance driver in the sky. He'd constructed this narrative so completely that even Luke sometimes forgot what I'd done before we met, before I'd traded my military call sign for a civilian registration number. My medical evacuation business, Lifeline Aviation, operated from a small hangar at Norfolk Regional. What Simon didn't know, what I'd carefully hidden, was that we held classified contracts with 3 government agencies. The tourist helicopter story he'd spread at the officers' club was so far from reality that my business partner Maria, a former Army medic who'd lost her leg in Kandahar, had created an entire false paper trail to support it. We'd let Simon believe his own fiction because the truth would have threatened his carefully maintained superiority. "I appreciate the opportunity to observe," I said, keeping my voice soft, submissive, the tone I'd perfected to protect Luke's career. Simon liked his daughter-in-law quiet, supportive, preferably invisible. For 3 years I'd given him exactly what he wanted, even as it ate away at something fundamental inside me. After dinner, while Luke helped clear dishes and Simon sat in the living room watching his military history documentaries, I stood at the kitchen sink studying my reflection in the window. The woman staring back had learned to make herself smaller, to occupy less space, to speak only when addressed. She wore cardigans instead of flight suits, carried diaper bags instead of survival gear, and attended PTA meetings instead of mission briefings. But underneath that carefully constructed exterior, Major Brianna Mitchell still existed. Valkyrie 77, who'd flown into Hellfire to extract wounded soldiers. Who'd earned a Distinguished Flying Cross for actions that remained classified. Who'd saved 15 men in Helmand Province, including Simon's brother Nathan, though Simon had no idea his son had married the pilot who'd defied death and physics to bring his brother home. Later that night, after we'd returned to our modest 2-story house 6 blocks from the base, I sat in my home office while Luke put the girls to bed. The room was deliberately mundane. Family photos, children's artwork, a filing cabinet full of school permission slips and tax documents. But hidden in a locked drawer beneath old warranties and instruction manuals was a manila folder I'd been building for 3 years. Inside were the declassified portions of my service record, mission reports with redacted sections that still told enough of the story, and most importantly, the commendation letter signed by Admiral Simon Hawthorne himself, praising Major B. Mitchell for extraordinary valor in Operation Crimson Sand. He'd never connected B. Mitchell to Brianna, his son's wife. The thought had simply never occurred to him that the pilot who'd saved his brother could be the same woman he'd spent 3 years treating like furniture. The morning preparation ritual that Tuesday began at 5:30 a.m., as it had every day for 3 years. Luke's uniform hung in our bedroom waiting for my attention. I pressed each crease with mechanical precision, aligned his ribbons using a ruler, ensuring his appearance would be beyond reproach. Simon judged military families by their perfection, and I'd learned to weaponize that perfectionism as camouflage. Sarah and Emma's lunch boxes sat on the kitchen counter. Ham and cheese for Sarah, who hated peanut butter, turkey for Emma, who was going through a phase where she'd only eat specific foods in specific orders. I wrote their daily notes on small cards, hearts and smiley faces decorating messages about being brave and kind. They'd never know their mother's definition of brave included flying through rocket-propelled grenades with half a helicopter systems failing. Luke found me in the kitchen at 6:15, freshly showered and reaching for the uniform I'd prepared. He kissed my forehead, a gesture both tender and apologetic. He knew what his father was planning at the briefing. He tried to talk Simon out of it, but once the Admiral set a course, deviation was impossible. "You don't have to go," he said quietly, fastening his ribbons. "I can tell him you're sick, that the girls need you." "It's fine," I replied, pouring his coffee into the travel mug he'd used since his academy days. "Your father wants to teach me about real military operations. Maybe I'll learn something." The words tasted bitter, but I kept my expression neutral. Luke studied my face, searching for signs of the anger he knew I had every right to feel. But I'd gotten very good at hiding things from the Hawthorne men. It was safer that way for all of us. At 6:45 a.m., I kissed both girls goodbye at the breakfast table, their cereal bowls half empty and backpacks waiting by the door. Emma looked up from her worksheet, a math problem about fractions that she'd been struggling with since yesterday. "Mom, why are you dressed fancy?" she asked, noting my pressed slacks and blazer instead of my usual jeans and comfortable shirt. "Just a meeting at the base," I told her, smoothing her dark hair that matched Luke's perfectly. Sarah barely glanced up from her book about dolphins, already lost in ocean facts she'd recite later whether anyone wanted to hear them or not. They had no reason to suspect this Tuesday was different from any other. No idea their mother was about to walk into a carefully orchestrated ambush. The drive to Naval Station Norfolk took 18 minutes through morning traffic that moved with frustrating predictability. School buses stopped at every corner, parents in minivans heading to drop-offs, contractors' trucks making their way to job sites. My phone, mounted on the dashboard, lit up with Luke's text at the second red light. "Dad was weird at breakfast. Kept talking about teaching someone about knowing their place. Think Jenkins is getting demoted. Be careful driving." Poor Luke. Still believing his father's venom was aimed at some junior officer instead of recognizing the target had always been me. I'd watched Simon perfect this technique over 3 years. The indirect attack, the plausible deniability, the way he could destroy someone while maintaining complete professional distance. Luke had been raised in that shadow, trained to interpret his father's moods but blind to the patterns when they involved people Simon deemed unworthy of consideration. I typed back at the next light, "Thanks for the warning. Love you." Short, simple, giving nothing away about my recognition of Simon's true intentions or my own preparations for what was coming. The base gates appeared through morning haze, guards checking identification with the kind of thorough boredom that came from repetitive security work. My civilian contractor pass earned a second look, then a wave through. I'd had that pass for 2 years, consulting on medical evacuation protocols, though Simon had managed to keep that information from spreading among his social circle. In the visitor parking area, I pulled in between 2 official vehicles, their government plates declaring their importance to anyone who cared to notice. As I gathered my things, movement caught my eye. Sandra Torres struggling with grocery bags near her SUV 3 spaces over. Commander Torres's wife, a woman who'd perfected the military spouse role to an art form that even Simon couldn't criticize. "Brianna," Sandra called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of sympathy reserved for those about to face unpleasant situations. She abandoned her groceries and walked over, her expression carefully composed but her eyes full of warning. I didn't expect to see you here today. Simon invited me to observe his briefing, I said, keeping my voice neutral while reading the knowledge in her face. Sandra glanced around, then leaned closer, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper that still carried perfectly in the morning air. He's been talking about this at the officers' club all week. Marcus came home last night saying your father-in-law was planning to, she paused, choosing her words carefully, put his son's wife in her proper context. Those were his exact words. Marcus was uncomfortable with it, said it felt wrong, but you know how Simon is when he decides something needs to happen. The confirmation of what I'd suspected landed without surprise. Simon had been broadcasting his intentions, building an audience for my humiliation, ensuring maximum witnesses to whatever lesson he planned to teach. The only variable he hadn't considered was that his target had been preparing for this moment longer than he'd been planning it. I appreciate the warning, I told Sandra, meaning it. She'd risked Simon's displeasure by telling me, a small act of rebellion in the rigid social hierarchy of military families. Just be careful, Sandra said, squeezing my arm before returning to her groceries. That man has destroyed careers for less than what he thinks you've done to his family's reputation. Inside the administrative building, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, air conditioning fighting Virginia's October humidity with aggressive efficiency. The lobby bustled with controlled chaos, uniforms moving with purpose while civilian contractors clustered near the security desk, waiting for escorts or directions. I approached the desk where Petty Officer Williams sat reviewing a clipboard, his young face focused with the intensity of someone still new enough to take every regulation seriously. Civilian consultant for Admiral Hawthorne's briefing, I said, sliding my identification across the counter. Williams looked at my ID, then at his list, then back at my ID with confusion creeping across his features. He checked the list again, running his finger down the names twice before looking up at me with barely concealed bewilderment. Ma'am, you're on the list, but... He paused, clearly trying to figure out how to phrase his question professionally. It says civilian consultant, but the annotation shows you're the Admiral's daughter-in-law. Do you need a visitor badge or should I call for an escort since you're family? Visitor badge is fine, I said, watching him process this bureaucratic puzzle. I'm here in a professional capacity. The confusion deepened, but Williams was too well-trained to question further. He printed my badge, the words civilian consultant bold across the bottom, and handed it over with directions to conference room beyond the 3rd floor. As I clipped it to my blazer, 2 lieutenants near the elevator caught my attention, their voices carrying despite their attempt at discretion. Heard the Admiral's planning something for the briefing, one said, young enough that his uniform still looked like a costume. Something about demonstrating the difference between real service and civilian pretenders. Whatever it is, I'm glad I'm not the target, his companion replied, pressing the elevator button with unnecessary force. Hawthorne's been in a mood all week. Yesterday he spent 20 minutes explaining why civilian contractors dilute military culture. They noticed me approaching and fell silent, offering polite nods before stepping into the elevator. I waited for the next one, using the moment to center myself, to feel the weight of what was coming and what I'd prepared. The 3rd floor bathroom was empty, fluorescent lights harsh against white tile and mirror that reflected more truth than comfort. I stood at the sink, studying the woman I'd allowed myself to become under Simon's constant pressure. My shoulders curved inward, trained to make myself smaller in his presence. My voice had dropped to softer registers, never challenging, never asserting. Even my posture had adapted, unconsciously deferring to his authority in 1,000 small ways that had accumulated over 3 years like sediment, burying the officer I'd once been. I straightened my spine against the mirror's harsh truth, pulling my shoulders back into something resembling the posture I'd once carried with pride. The bathroom door opened behind me and Lieutenant Morrison entered, one of the 2 female officers I'd noticed earlier. She nodded politely, moving to the sink beside mine, but I caught her double take in the peripheral vision, recognition without quite placing why she knew my face. The walk from the bathroom to conference room stretched down a hallway lined with photographs of naval history, admirals and battles frozen in black and white glory. My footsteps echoed against polished floors, each step carrying me closer to Simon's carefully prepared trap. The door stood open, voices spilling out in that particular tone of pre-meeting conversation where everyone pretended to be relaxed while mentally calculating their position in the hierarchy. I paused at the threshold, taking in the scene Simon had orchestrated. The briefing room's tiered seating held 43 officers, their dress whites creating a sea of institutional authority. The conversations created a low rumble of masculine confidence, technical jargon mixed with careful laughter, the sound of people who belonged here comparing notes on deployments and training exercises. That rumble stopped momentarily as I entered, a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure as they registered a civilian woman among them. Then it resumed with increased intensity as recognition dawned across multiple faces. I was the Admiral's problematic daughter-in-law who didn't understand military culture. Commander Torres sat in the front row, and his eyes widened slightly when he saw me, no doubt remembering his wife's warning in the parking lot. He gave me the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, a gesture that said he knew what was coming and disagreed with it but wouldn't risk his career intervening. Behind him, clusters of lieutenants and commanders arranged themselves according to some invisible protocol I'd once known by heart but now observed as an outsider. I chose a seat in the fifth row, visible enough to be properly humiliated but not so prominent as to appear defiant. The chair was uncomfortable, designed for function rather than comfort, and I settled into it while conversations swirled around me. Nobody spoke to me directly, though several officers shot curious glances my way, trying to figure out why a civilian, and specifically this civilian, had been invited to their operational briefing. 2 rows ahead, I heard Captain Roberts telling another officer about a training exercise gone wrong, something about helicopter maintenance and scheduling conflicts. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were discussing the exact type of logistics I'd managed flawlessly for 12 years. But to them I was just Luke's wife who played with helicopters on weekends. At 0858 the room began to quiet, that institutional conditioning that made military personnel unconsciously aware of approaching authority. Papers shuffled, coffee cups found stable surfaces, phones disappeared into pockets. The transformation from casual to professional happened in seconds, decades of training manifesting in collective precision. Simon entered with theatrical precision at exactly 0900, not a second before or after. The door opened as if cued by his approach, and he strode through with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. His uniform was beyond perfect. It was a statement of supremacy, every ribbon aligned with mathematical precision, every crease sharp enough to wound. His presence commanded instant attention, filling the room the way water fills a container, leaving no space for anything else. His eyes found mine immediately with predatory satisfaction, a quick scan that confirmed I'd walked into his trap as expected. I watched him savor the moment, the slight upturn of his mouth that anyone else might mistake for a professional smile but I recognized as anticipation. He moved to the podium with measured steps, letting his authority settle over the room like a weight. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying that particular command resonance that made spines straighten automatically. "And ladies," he added, nodding toward Lieutenant Morrison and her colleague with perfunctory acknowledgement that managed to minimize their presence while technically including them. The presentation began with tactical aviation operations, slides clicking through deployment statistics and operational readiness assessments. Simon's voice found that rhythm of military briefing, professional and precise, designed to convey maximum information with minimum emotion. Charts appeared showing helicopter availability rates, maintenance schedules, mission success percentages, all the metrics that reduced human courage to spreadsheet cells. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, playing the role of the attentive civilian trying to understand complex military concepts. Around me, officers took notes with varying degrees of engagement. Some scribbled frantically, probably junior officers trying to impress with their attention to detail. Others, more senior, made occasional marks while their minds clearly wandered to other responsibilities. 30 minutes into statistics about operational readiness, Simon was explaining extraction protocols, his hands moving in practice gestures that illustrated tactical movements. He was mid-sentence about weather considerations when he paused, the break so deliberate it pulled everyone's attention forward. His timing was perfect, calculated to ensure maximum focus before the strike. He turned from the screen to face the room fully, his expression shifting to something that might have been paternal if he didn't know better. His gaze swept across the assembled officers before landing on me with the precision of a targeting system. "Actually, before we continue this discussion of tactical aviation, he said, his voice taking on a tone of manufactured warmth that made my skin crawl. I should acknowledge our special guest today. Every head in the room turned toward me. 43 sets of eyes following Simon's gesture as he raised his hand toward me with patronizing grandeur, like a ringmaster presenting a particularly amusing act. My daughter-in-law has joined us today as a civilian observer, he continued, the words, daughter-in-law, dripping with just enough condescension to make his opinion clear. She flies helicopters herself, you know. Tourist work. Sunset tours over Virginia Beach, I believe. Perhaps she'll learn something about how real military operations function. The laughter started as uncomfortable chuckles from a few junior officers who weren't sure if they were supposed to find this funny. But Simon's expression gave them permission, his own smile widening as he delivered the next blow. Tell me, Brianna, he said, his voice taking on exaggerated sweetness that wouldn't fool a child. Since you're a pilot yourself, what's your call sign? Do civilian pilots have those? What do they call you, sweetheart? Angel wings. He paused, letting the anticipation build before delivering the final insult with perfect timing. Princess? The room erupted. The uncomfortable chuckles transformed into genuine laughter, some officers actually slapping their knees or elbowing their neighbors. It was the kind of laughter that came from relief. They weren't the target, someone else was being offered up for humiliation, and they could participate safely from the sidelines. The laughter washed over me like white noise, distant and irrelevant. Captain Roberts actually wiped tears from his eyes, and someone in the back row whistled appreciatively at Simon's joke. I counted 3 heartbeats, letting them have their moment, letting them commit fully to their amusement. Then I moved. Standing slowly, I let my full height straighten for the first time in years. My spine uncurled vertebra by vertebra, shoulders rolling back into alignment, chin lifting to the angle I'd carried through combat zones. The transformation happened in seconds but felt like shedding an ill-fitting costume. The room's laughter faltered slightly at the change, though most continued their amusement, unaware they were about to witness professional destruction. My hands remained steady at my sides as I met Simon's gaze directly. No deference now, no carefully crafted submission. Just the steady look I'd perfected through 100 pre-flight briefings when the odds said we shouldn't fly but lives depended on us going anyway. It's Valkyrie. The 2 words dropped into the room with the precision of a surgical strike. I let each syllable carry the weight of 100 missions, the authority of someone who'd earned their name in fire and blood rather than conference rooms and political maneuvering. The effect was instantaneous. 43 faces froze simultaneously, laughter dying in throats mid-chuckle. Commander Torres choked on his coffee, the sound sharp in the sudden silence. His coughing fit lasted 3 seconds before he managed to gasp out a single word that changed everything. Valkyrie. Because everyone in that room knew the legend of Valkyrie 77 who'd flown Operation Crimson Sand. They'd heard the stories whispered in ready rooms, passed around during deployments, discussed in hushed tones at officers' clubs. The pilot who'd done the impossible, who'd defied physics and probability to bring people home. None of them had connected that legend to the Admiral's dismissed daughter-in-law. Lieutenant Morrison's hand flew to her mouth. Captain Roberts's jaw went slack. In the 3rd row, a young ensign dropped his pen, and it clattered against the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. Simon's smile flickered, uncertainty creeping into his expression for the first time since I'd known him. August 2018, Helmand Province. My voice cut through their stunned silence with clinical precision. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth carried its own weight. Each word landed like evidence being presented to a jury, building a case they couldn't dismiss. 15 men extracted under heavy fire. Enemy RPGs had taken out half our hydraulics. My co-pilot, Lieutenant David Park, was unconscious from shrapnel wounds, bleeding through his flight suit while I held the stick with both hands, fighting to keep us airborne. The extraction zone was hot. Taliban fighters had surrounded the SEAL team's position, and we were taking fire from 3 directions. The room had gone completely still. Even breathing seemed to have stopped. Simon's hands found the edges of the podium, gripping hard enough that his knuckles showed white through his skin. His face had lost color, recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes. Including Master Chief Nathan Hawthorne. The name landed like a physical blow. Simon actually swayed, catching himself against the podium. Around the room, officers exchanged glances, connecting dots that had never seemed related before. Nathan Hawthorne, the Admiral's brother, the decorated SEAL who died in action 2 years ago, but not before Operation Crimson Sand had given him those extra years. Your brother, Admiral. I kept my voice level, professional, though the memory of that night still lived in my bones. He was bleeding out from a femoral wound when we loaded him. Lost consciousness twice during the flight. He came to long enough to beg me not to let him die before he could hold his daughter. She'd been born 3 weeks earlier while he was deployed. He had her picture taped inside his helmet. Someone whispered, "Dear God," from the back row. Another officer had pulled out his phone, likely searching for declassified details about Crimson Sand, trying to verify what couldn't possibly be true, that the woman their admiral had mocked for 3 years was the pilot who'd become legend. I flew with half my hydraulics gone and my co-pilot unconscious, navigating by muscle memory and instinct when the instruments failed. The helicopter was shaking so badly that my crew chief, Sergeant Martinez, dislocated his shoulder trying to provide covering fire. We took 17 hits to the fuselage. The crew counted them later, amazed we'd stayed airborne. Simon's face had cycled through a spectrum of emotions: shock, disbelief, and now something approaching horror as the implications crashed over him. His carefully orchestrated humiliation was collapsing, revealing something far worse than simple cruelty. He'd been dismissing the very person who'd saved his brother's life. Nathan lived long enough to meet his daughter because I refused to let him die on my watch. 2 years later he sent me a letter before his final deployment. He wanted someone to know the truth about that night, about the decisions that nearly killed all 15 men before we even launched. The whispers started then, spreading through the room like wildfire. Crimson Sand. Impossible. That was her. Officers leaned toward each other, voices urgent but hushed, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever was happening. Commander Torres had recovered from his coughing fit and now stared at me with an expression of absolute recognition. He'd been there. He knew. I pulled out my phone with deliberate calm, swiping to a document I'd saved 6 months ago when the classification levels had finally dropped. The screen displayed the header clearly: Operation Crimson Sand After Action Report Declassified. The official seal was visible, along with the date stamp and authorization codes that verified its authenticity. The declassified report makes for interesting reading, Admiral. I held the phone up, though the screen was too small for anyone but me to read clearly. That didn't matter. They could see it was real, official, undeniable. Particularly the section about command decisions that night. 3 abort recommendations from the weather officer. 3 overruled by you personally. Simon's legs seemed to lose strength. He gripped the podium with both hands now, no longer for emphasis but for support. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him gray and hollow looking under the fluorescent lights. You prioritized your operation timeline over pilot safety assessments. The report notes, and I quote, "Command's insistence on immediate extraction despite weather warnings created unnecessary risk to both air crew and ground personnel. That's military speak for you nearly killed your own brother through arrogance." The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The air conditioning hummed overhead, suddenly audible in the vacuum of sound. 43 officers sat frozen, witnessing something none of them had expected when they'd walked into this routine briefing. They'd come to see the Admiral put his daughter-in-law in her place. Instead they were watching him confront the reality that he'd spent 3 years diminishing the hero who'd saved his brother's life. A captain in the second row suddenly stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh metallic sound that cut through the silence. His face was flushed, eyes wide with something between disbelief and recognition. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "If you're Valkyrie 77, then you're the one who—" He stopped, looking at Simon, then back at me, clearly torn between finishing his thought and maintaining protocol. The revelation about Nathan wasn't random. 2 months ago, I'd been sorting through old mission files in my office when Maria had knocked on my door with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Her military intelligence contacts, people she kept in touch with despite losing her leg in Kandahar, had uncovered something while investigating declassified operations. Simon had hidden his brother's survival story from everyone, including Luke, because admitting Nathan lived those extra 2 years meant acknowledging someone else's heroism. Specifically, a female pilot who defied his direct orders to abort the mission. Maria had printed everything, handed me the folder without a word, and watched my face as I read through reports that painted a picture of systematic deception. Simon had buried the truth so deeply that his own son didn't know his uncle had survived Crimson Sand, didn't know about the 2 years of letters Nathan had written, didn't know about the growing rift between the brothers that had nothing to do with military service and everything to do with conscience. Lieutenant Morrison had her phone out now, holding it at an angle that suggested she was recording. One of only 2 female officers present, she understood what was happening here went beyond personal drama. This was about systemic dismissal, about how women in service were erased from their own stories. Her colleague, Lieutenant Chin, sat frozen beside her, hands clenched in her lap as if physically restraining herself from speaking. I reached into my blazer's inner pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper I'd carried for 6 months. The edges were worn from handling from the times I'd taken it out late at night when Luke was asleep, reading Nathan's words and wondering when the right moment would come to reveal them. Admiral Hawthorne, I said, using his formal title deliberately, establishing the professional distance he'd always insisted upon. Your commendation letter to Major B. Mitchell praised exceptional courage under impossible conditions. You called that pilot a credit to naval aviation and recommended them for the Distinguished Flying Cross. I unfolded the letter slowly, letting the paper's rustling fill the silent room. Several officers leaned forward, trying to see what I held. Simon's face had gone from gray to something approaching translucent, as if all the blood had simply evacuated his body. Yet you've spent 3 years belittling the same pilot at family dinners. You introduced me as Tyler to Admiral Morrison at last year's Navy ball. Wrong name, deliberately wrong, a small cruelty designed to show how little I mattered. You told Captain Richards at the officers' club that I'd trapped your son into marriage, that Luke could have done so much better if he'd waited for a proper military match. Commander Torres shifted in his seat, his expression darkening. These weren't secrets. Simon had been openly dismissive of me in military social circles for years. But context changed everything. The woman he'd been diminishing was the same one he'd once called exceptional in official documentation. 6 months before Nathan died, he visited me. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples through the assembled officers. He found my office through military records, showed up on a Thursday afternoon without warning. He needed to thank me personally, he said. But that wasn't really why he came. Simon's breathing had become audible, shallow gasps that seemed to echo in the silent room. His hands trembled where they gripped the podium, and I saw him glance toward the door as if calculating whether he could simply leave. But leaving would be admitting everything, confirming every word, and his pride wouldn't allow that escape. Nathan couldn't forgive you for gambling with 15 lives to protect your perfect mission record. Those were his words, Admiral, not mine. He said the guilt was eating you alive, making you angry at everyone who reminded you of that night. Including me. Especially me, because I was the evidence that your judgment had been wrong, that you'd nearly killed your own brother and 14 other men because you couldn't admit whether conditions made the mission too dangerous. I held up Nathan's letter, his handwriting visible even from a distance. Bold, slanted, unmistakably his for anyone who'd known him. He wanted someone to know the truth before he died. He had a feeling, he said, about his next deployment. Called it intuition from too many years in combat zones. He was right. 6 weeks later he was gone. The sound Lieutenant Morrison's phone made as she zoomed in on the letter was barely audible, but in the silence, it might as well have been a siren. Other officers were pulling out their own phones now, not recording but searching, looking for information about Crimson Sand, about weather reports from that night, about anything that might verify or refute what they were hearing. Should I read his exact words, Admiral? I asked, though I didn't wait for permission. Nathan's message deserved to be heard by witnesses who could understand its weight. If something happens to me, I read, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through, someone needs to know about Simon's pattern. Crimson Sand wasn't isolated. Operation Redstone in 2016. 7 dead because he ignored terrain warnings. Operation Nightfall in 2017. 3 casualties from pushing through despite equipment failures. He buries the reports, uses connections to keep investigations surface level, and good people keep dying for his reputation. The room erupted. Not in laughter this time, but in shocked exclamations, urgent whispers, chairs creaking as officers turned to each other with expressions of disbelief and growing anger. Someone in the back row cursed softly but audibly. Another officer stood up, then sat back down, clearly unsure what protocol demanded in this situation. Captain Roberts had his phone out, typing furiously. I caught a glimpse of his screen. He was searching for Operation Redstone, finding the sanitized public report that mentioned casualties but not causes. The real reports, the ones Nathan had referenced, were still classified, but their existence was confirmed by the very fact that sanitized versions existed at all. That's enough, Simon said, but his voice came out as barely a whisper, lacking any authority. He cleared his throat, tried again. That's classified information. You can't. It's not classified anymore, I interrupted, holding up my phone again. Crimson Sand was declassified 6 months ago. Nathan's letter isn't classified at all. It's personal correspondence. And those other operations you buried? Inspector General's office has been very interested in patterns of command failure. Especially when those patterns are documented by a deceased SEAL who had no reason to lie. The weight of what I'd revealed seemed to press down on the room. These weren't just personal failures or family drama. This was about systemic command failures that had cost lives, cover-ups that went to the heart of military integrity. Every officer present understood they were witnessing something that would have repercussions far beyond this briefing room, beyond Simon's career, beyond any personal vendetta between a dismissive father-in-law and the daughter-in-law he'd never bothered to truly know. The silence stretched until Commander Torres pushed back his chair, the metal legs scraping against the floor with a sound that made everyone turn. His face had gone pale beneath his Florida tan, and his hands trembled slightly as he stood. He was a big man, 6'3" with shoulders that suggested he'd played college football before choosing the Navy, but in that moment he looked somehow smaller, burdened by something he'd carried too long. I need to say something, Torres began, his voice shaking in a way I'd never heard from a senior officer. He looked directly at me, then at Simon, then back at me as if trying to decide which truth to tell first. I was there. Crimson Sand. I was one of the 15. The admission landed in the room with physical weight. Several officers turned in their seats to stare at him. Captain Roberts dropped his phone entirely, and it clattered onto the table with a sharp crack that nobody acknowledged. Torres had never mentioned this in 3 years of serving under Simon, 3 years of briefings and meetings where Crimson Sand had become legend but never personal testimony. Major Mitchell, Valkyrie, she saved my life that night. Not just technically, not just as part of the extraction. I mean literally saved my life. His voice gained strength as he continued, as if speaking the truth freed something that had been trapped. I was hit during the firefight before extraction. Shrapnel in my chest, couldn't breathe right. The medic said I needed immediate evac or I wouldn't make it. But Admiral Hawthorne, he paused, swallowing hard. Admiral Hawthorne wanted us to hold position for better weather. Said the mission parameters didn't justify the risk to aviation assets. Simon's mouth opened but no words emerged. His aide, Lieutenant Williams, had gone rigid in his seat near the front, his young face cycling through expressions of disbelief and growing comprehension. She came anyway, Torres continued, his eyes locked on mine now. Flew through conditions that should have torn the helicopter apart. I remember lying on the floor of that bird, watching her fight the controls while rounds punched through the fuselage around us, thinking this woman was going to die trying to save us. My blood was all over the deck. Park, her co-pilot, was unconscious and bleeding out. And she just kept flying, kept fighting like our lives mattered more than hers. He turned to face the room fully, addressing everyone now, his voice carrying the authority of witnessed truth. And when we got back, when the after-action report criticized command decisions that night, Admiral Hawthorne buried it. He took credit for the mission's success in his fitness reports, used our survival to justify his promotion to his current position. But the success was hers, not his. We lived because she defied abort orders, not because of his tactical brilliance. Before anyone could respond, Captain Roberts stood as well, his weathered face set in grim lines. Operation Redstone 2016, he said quietly, but his words carried clearly. I lost 2 men because Admiral Hawthorne insisted we proceed despite equipment failures. Said delaying would impact operational tempo. The investigation afterward blamed mechanical failure, but we all knew the equipment problems were documented and ignored. Another officer, Lieutenant Commander Phillips from the 3rd row, stood slowly. Operation Nightfall 2017. He overruled weather holds 3 times in 1 week. Said we were being too cautious, that real warriors didn't let a little rain stop them. We lost a helicopter and 3 souls on the last mission. The report called it pilot error. The testimonies came faster now, officers standing one after another, years of buried truth spilling into the room like water through a broken dam. Each story painted the same picture. A commander who prioritized statistics over safety, reputation over responsibility, whose ribbons represented other people's blood and sacrifice. My phone buzzed against my leg. I glanced down to see Maria's message. It's done. Every military journalist from here to DC has the files. CNN just called asking for comment. You've got about 30 minutes before this goes national. I hadn't asked her to do this. We'd never discussed releasing the files publicly. But Maria had sat beside me for 3 years, watching Simon's dismissiveness eat away at my confidence, watching me make myself smaller to protect Luke's career. She'd decided independently that today's revelation deserved a wider audience than this single briefing room. Lieutenant Morrison had lowered her phone but kept recording, her face set with the determination of someone documenting history. Beside her, Lieutenant Chin had tears running down her face, though whether from anger or validation I couldn't tell. They understood what this meant for every female service member whose contributions had been minimized, whose heroism had been rewritten to glorify someone else. The room's attention shifted suddenly to the front corner where Lieutenant Williams, Simon's aide, had stood up. At 24, Williams looked like he'd stepped out of a recruiting poster. Clean-cut, earnest, the kind of young officer who still believed the system worked if you just followed the rules. His voice cracked when he started speaking. Last week, Admiral Hawthorne ordered me to destroy documents related to Crimson Sand. The confession emerged in a rush, as if he'd been holding it back by physical force. He'd learned about the declassification through back channels. There were original communications, weather reports, recorded abort recommendations, evidence that hadn't made it into even the classified files. He told me to shred everything, said it was routine cleanup of outdated materials. Simon's face contorted, his mouth working soundlessly. Williams continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. I couldn't do it. My father flew helicopters in Vietnam. He taught me that integrity matters more than career, that truth matters more than rank. So instead of destroying the documents, I copied everything and submitted it to the Inspector General's office yesterday morning. They confirmed receipt at 0800 today, about an hour before this briefing started. The sound Simon made wasn't quite a word, more a strangled gasp of recognition that his career, his reputation, his entire constructed identity was collapsing in real time. He released the podium and actually staggered, catching himself against the projection screen behind him. You all need to understand, Williams continued, looking around the room at his fellow officers. This isn't just about one mission or one person. There's a pattern here, documented across years of operations. Good people died because of ego. Heroes were erased because they didn't fit the narrative. Major Mitchell, Valkyrie, she represents everyone whose sacrifice got rewritten to make someone else look good. The room erupted into chaos. Officers were on their feet, voices raised not in laughter but in anger, in validation, in the kind of righteous fury that comes when systematic injustice is finally exposed. Someone near the back actually applauded Williams and others joined in, the sound building until it filled the room. But the applause wasn't celebratory. It was defiant, a collective acknowledgement that they were witnessing something necessary, something overdue. Through it all, I stood perfectly still in the 5th row, feeling the weight of 3 years of diminishment finally lifting from my shoulders. This wasn't about revenge anymore, wasn't about personal vindication. It had become something larger, a reckoning for everyone whose truth had been buried beneath someone else's ambition. The applause for Williams gradually faded, leaving behind a charged atmosphere that felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Simon stood against the projection screen, his body seeming to shrink with each passing second. His phone, face up on the podium, lit up with call after call, the screen showing names of admirals, Pentagon officials, and numbers from Washington that made several officers in the room exchange worried glances. The silence after Williams's confession stretched until it became unbearable. Then Simon finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. It's all true. The words came out broken, each one seeming to cost him physically. He looked at me directly for the first time since I'd revealed myself as Valkyrie, and in his eyes I saw something I'd never witnessed before: complete defeat. You saved Nathan. You saved my brother, and I spent 3 years trying to erase you from my life because your very existence reminded me that I nearly killed him. He pushed himself away from the screen, standing unsupported though his legs visibly trembled. The commanding presence that had dominated every room for 3 decades had evaporated, leaving behind a man confronting the ruins of his own making. I threatened Luke's career, he continued, each admission falling like another stone into still water. Told him that difficult wives could derail promising officers. Made it clear that if you didn't play the supportive civilian role, if you drew attention to your service record, there would be consequences for his advancement. I wanted you quiet and small because every time you walked into a room with your shoulders back, every time you mentioned flying, you were evidence of my cowardice. Lieutenant Morrison shifted in her seat, her phone still recording, capturing this complete unraveling of military authority. She started clapping, not the wild applause of celebration, but slow, deliberate strikes of palm against palm that rang through the room like a judge's gavel. Commander Torres joined her, then Captain Roberts, then Phillips. One by one, every officer in that room rose to their feet, their applause building into something that wasn't quite celebration and wasn't quite condemnation. It was acknowledgement. Recognition. A standing ovation for truth finally spoken, for the officer who'd been erased being restored to her proper place in history. 43 officers on their feet, applauding while Simon stood frozen at his podium, watching 3 decades of carefully constructed authority crumble in real time. His phone continued its desperate dance of notifications. Missed calls, text messages, emails marked urgent. The outside world was catching up to what had just transpired in this room, and Simon knew his reckoning had only just begun. I remained seated for a moment longer, feeling the weight of this moment settle into my bones. Then I stood, not to accept the applause but to deliver one final truth that would complete the picture of Simon's fundamental misunderstanding of who I was. "There's something else you should know, Admiral," I said, and the room quieted immediately, the applause dying as officers recognized there was more to come. "That medical evacuation company you've spent 3 years mocking as tourist flights? The one you told everyone about at the officers' club, laughing about how I fly sick people between hospitals." I pulled up another document on my phone. A contract header with Department of Defense seals and classification markings that made several officers lean forward instinctively. Lifeline Aviation holds 3 classified contracts with the Department of Defense. We've been running medical extractions in zones that officially don't have American presence. Places where soldiers get hurt doing things that never happened, where they need evacuation by pilots who don't exist on any official record. In 3 years of what you called playing with helicopters, I've flown more combat-adjacent missions than most active-duty pilots see in a full career. Gasps rippled through the room. Commander Torres actually sat back down, his legs apparently unable to support this new revelation. These officers understood what those contracts meant. Black Ops support, special operations backup, the kind of flying that happened in shadows and saved lives that couldn't be acknowledged. The suburban housewife you demanded I become, the quiet woman who packed lunches and attended PTA meetings. She was a cover story. Every time you dismissed me at family dinners, every time you introduced me with the wrong name or forgot what I did for a living, I was returning from missions you weren't even cleared to know existed. I saved more lives in the last 3 years than you have ribbons on that chest, all while pretending to be diminished because you made it clear that's what Luke's career required. Simon's phone rang again, a specific ringtone that made every officer in the room straighten instinctively. The Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the entire Navy, was calling, and Simon couldn't even move to answer it. His hands hung at his sides, trembling visibly as the weight of his actions pressed down with crushing force. Then he did something that nobody expected, something that would be talked about in military circles for years afterward. Simon reached up to his chest and began removing his ribbons. One by one, with shaking fingers, he unpinned the decorations that had defined his identity for 3 decades. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Legion of Merit. Each one came off with a small metallic click that seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. He placed them on the podium in a neat row, the same precision he'd always demanded in everything, this final act of military bearing in the midst of complete personal collapse. When the last ribbon was removed, his uniform looked naked, vulnerable, like armor with all the plates removed. Simon looked directly at me, and when he spoke, his voice was steady for the first time since I'd said the word Valkyrie. "You're the officer I pretended to be." The words hung in the air, a complete inversion of everything he'd believed about hierarchy, about worth, about what constituted real service. Without another word, without waiting for responses or reactions, Simon turned and walked out of his own briefing room. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely, leaving 43 witnesses to the complete dismantling of everything they'd believed about power, respect, and worth. The ribbons remained on the podium, catching the fluorescent light, physical evidence of a career built on others' sacrifices. Lieutenant Williams moved first, walking to the podium and carefully collecting them, not as trophies but as evidence for what would surely be a comprehensive investigation. The briefing room remained frozen for several minutes after Williams placed the ribbons in an evidence bag, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like a requiem for everything that had just transpired. Officers began filing out slowly, many stopping to shake my hand or simply nod in acknowledgement, their expressions ranging from shock to something approaching reverence. Lieutenant Morrison approached last, pressing a small card into my palm with her personal phone number written on it. "For when you're ready to tell the full story," she said quietly. "The real one, not the sanitized version they'll try to create." I sat alone in the empty room for another 10 minutes, feeling the weight of 3 years lifting from my shoulders while simultaneously recognizing that everything in my life was about to change. My phone showed 47 missed calls and nearly 200 text messages, but I ignored them all, needing this moment of silence before facing whatever came next. Luke arrived within an hour, bursting through the conference room door with an expression I'd never seen before, equal parts fury, pride, and profound relief. He'd received 17 different calls about what had transpired, each account adding another layer to the story, each caller more incredulous than the last. But instead of anger or confusion, instead of demanding explanations for why I'd never told him about Crimson Sand or Nathan or any of it, he simply crossed the room in 3 strides and wrapped me in his arms. "I've always known who you were," he whispered against my hair, holding me tight enough that I could feel his heart racing. "Not the details, not the missions, but I knew. Valkyrie, not the diminished version my father demanded. I've watched you make yourself smaller for 3 years and it's been killing me." He pulled back just enough to meet my eyes and I saw tears there, something I'd witnessed only twice in our entire marriage. "I've been documenting everything," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Every threat he made about my career, every time he demanded you play a role, every dismissive comment. I have recordings, emails, a file 3 inches thick. I was preparing to walk away from the Navy entirely if that's what it took. I'd already drafted my resignation letter. It's been in my desk drawer for 6 months. The revelation stunned me into silence. Luke, who'd grown up in the shadow of military greatness, who'd built his entire identity around service and tradition, had been ready to abandon everything rather than watch his father continue to diminish me. The sacrifice he'd been prepared to make quietly and without fanfare said more about his character than any ribbon or rank ever could. 6 months later, I found myself in an oak-paneled room at the Pentagon, sitting before a military review board that would determine Simon's fate. He faced potential court-martial for falsifying reports, endangering personnel, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The evidence Williams had preserved, combined with the testimonies from that briefing room, painted a damning picture of systematic failure and cover-ups spanning years. When called to testify, I did something that shocked everyone present, including Simon himself. I argued for leniency. Destroying Admiral Hawthorne would waste the lesson he could teach others, I told the board, meeting each member's gaze in turn. He represents something systemic in military culture, the confusion of authority with infallibility, the belief that rank determines worth. Make him a cautionary tale, not a martyr. Let him retire with minimal dignity, but require him to teach ethics courses at the academy, using his own failures as curriculum. Make him stand before young officers and explain how arrogance costs lives, how dismissing expertise based on gender or civilian status weakens the entire force. That would serve justice better than any court-martial. The board deliberated for 3 days before accepting my recommendation. Simon would retire quietly, his record annotated but not destroyed, and spend 2 years teaching ethics courses where his own failures would become case studies in toxic leadership. The girls finally learned their mother's real history on a rainy Thursday evening when Sarah burst into the kitchen, laptop in hand, her face flushed with excitement and confusion. She'd found a news article about the Valkyrie revelation that had transformed military culture discussions nationwide, complete with a photo of me in my flight suit from years ago, standing beside a helicopter I'd flown through impossible conditions. "Mom, is this you?" Sarah demanded, turning the screen toward me while Emma peered over her shoulder, both of them wide-eyed with the kind of shock that comes from discovering your parent is not who you thought they were. "Yes," I said simply, setting down the dish towel and giving them my full attention. "That's me." Emma, always the more direct of the two, asked the question that mattered most. "Why didn't you tell us? Why did you hide it for so long?" I pulled out chairs for both of them, sitting down at our kitchen table where we'd shared countless ordinary moments, preparing to share something extraordinary. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to reveal your power, not constantly displaying it. For 3 years I chose to protect our family's peace over my own recognition. That wasn't weakness, it was strategy. But there comes a time when hiding your light to make others comfortable becomes a disservice to everyone, including those you're trying to protect. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand, her expression serious beyond her years. "Grandpa knows now, doesn't he? That's why he's been so different lately." Because Simon had been different. He now introduced me at military events as Commander Mitchell, the woman who saved my brother and my soul. His voice carrying genuine respect for the first time since I'd known him. Our relationship would never be warm. Too much damage had been done for that. But it had become honest. He sent handwritten letters monthly, each one acknowledging specific moments he'd dismissed me, cataloging every slight with the same precision he'd once applied to military operations. It was his penance, one he'd continue until he'd accounted for every dismissive comment, every forgotten name, every moment he'd made me smaller to make himself feel larger. I'd returned to flying under my real name, running missions that mattered, no longer hiding behind the facade of tourist flights or diminished expectations. Lifeline Aviation had expanded, taking on more contracts, hiring more pilots. Many of them women who'd heard about what happened in that briefing room and wanted to fly for someone who understood what it meant to be overlooked and underestimated. The respect I'd commanded in that briefing room hadn't been granted by Simon or anyone else. It had always been mine to claim. I'd simply chosen my moment, waited for the perfect conditions, and then revealed what had always been true. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. Sometimes it's about forcing them to see clearly, to acknowledge what they've refused to recognize, and to live with that knowledge forever. If this story of hidden identity and ultimate vindication left you breathless, hit that like button right now. My favorite moment was when Commander Torres stood up and revealed he was one of the 15 men saved during Crimson Sand. What was your most powerful moment? Share it in the comments below. Don't miss more gripping stories of truth revealed and respect reclaimed. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.